I am the true vine. It is one of the most famous statements Jesus ever made. It is printed on coffee mugs, framed in living rooms, and painted on church walls. For most modern readers, it sounds like a warm, pastoral metaphor about personal growth. It is usually read as a simple gardening illustration about how to be a better person, how to stay connected to God, and how to produce a little more spiritual fruit in our daily lives. But that is not what Jesus was doing. He was not giving a generic lesson on agricultural productivity. He was not inventing a spontaneous object lesson just to help his disciples feel close to him. He was doing something far heavier and far more profound. Look closely at the phrasing in John chapter 15, verse 1. Jesus does not simply say, "I am a vine." He says, "I am the true vine." That single word changes the entire reading. It is a detail that opens a deeper historical tension. If Jesus is the true vine, what is the former vine? Why did he need to use the word true to describe himself at all? To answer that, we have to look at the setting. The disciples are sitting with Jesus in the upper room. It is the night before his execution. The shadow of the cross is already falling over the conversation. Judas has just left into the dark to betray him. The air is heavy, time is running out. This is not the moment for a casual nature metaphor. Jesus is giving his final, most critical instructions to the men who will soon carry his message to the world. When he looks at them and invokes the image of the vine, he is speaking to Jewish men who knew their history. They knew exactly what the vine represented. For them, the vine was not just a plant, it was an identity. For centuries, the vine was the supreme symbol of the nation of Israel. It was the visual image of their covenant with God. It was stamped onto the coins in their pockets. It was carved in massive, golden relief over the great doors of the temple in Jerusalem. Every time a Jewish person walked into the temple courts, they saw the golden vine, recognizing it as the picture of who they were meant to be in the world. God had planted them. God had chosen them. God expected them to bear fruit for the surrounding nations. So, when Jesus stands up on the night of his betrayal and says, "I am the true vine," he is not erasing the old story. He is making a breathtaking theological claim. He is saying that the long, turbulent history of God's vineyard has come down to this singular moment. He is stepping into the place of the nation. He is bringing the shadow into substance. He is becoming what Israel was always meant to be. This was not a new illustration. It was the climax of an ancient pattern. But to understand the weight of what Jesus is doing in the upper room, and to understand why the old system was incomplete, we cannot start in the Gospel of John. We have to go back to the very beginning. We have to look at where the image of the vineyard first appears in Scripture. Because the story of the vine is actually the story of human failure, and the first time a man plants a vineyard, it ends in tragedy. To see why Jesus called himself the true vine, we have to look for the first one. If you want to understand any major theme in Scripture, you always look for its first appearance. The rule of first mention often sets the theological DNA for everything that follows. So, where does the vineyard first appear in the biblical story? It is not in the Garden of Eden. The garden had trees, but there is no mention of a vineyard. The first vineyard does not appear until after the world has been completely unmade and made again. The floodwaters have receded. The ark has finally come to rest. Noah and his family walk out into a washed, empty world. The biblical text presents Noah as a kind of second Adam. He is given the exact same command the first Adam received: be fruitful and multiply. He is standing at the dawn of a new creation. And in Genesis chapter 9, verse 20, the text tells us the very first thing this new Adam does. He becomes a man of the soil, and he plants a vineyard. That sounds small. It is not. In the ancient world, planting a vineyard was not like planting wheat or barley. You can plant wheat and harvest it in a single season. A vineyard is entirely different. A vineyard requires patience. It takes years of intense, careful labor. You have to clear the heavy stones, terrace the hillside, plant the delicate vines, prune them relentlessly, and wait. You do not plant a vineyard if you are running for your life. You do not plant a vineyard if you are a wandering nomad. You only plant a vineyard when you believe you have finally found a place of absolute, permanent rest. For Noah, planting a vineyard was an act of profound hope. It was a declaration of peace. He was trying to cultivate a new Eden with his own two hands. But look at what happens. Noah patiently tends the vines. He harvests the grapes. He makes wine. He drinks it. And the very next scene shows the new Adam lying violently drunk, naked, and uncovered inside his tent. His sons enter, a boundary is crossed, and a terrible curse fractures the human family all over again. The parallel to the first Eden is unavoidable. First, there is a new creation. Then, the cultivation of a fruit. Then, consumption. Then, sudden nakedness and deep shame. The first time a vineyard appears in the Bible, it is tied to the desperate human desire for rest, but it ends in total failure. The man of the soil could not handle the fruit of his own planting. The vineyard, meant to be a place of joy, became a place of exposure and ruin. This establishes a dark, realistic undertone for the rest of the biblical narrative. It shows us that humanity cannot cultivate its own perfect peace. Even when the world is washed clean by a global flood, the human heart remains untamed. We cannot plant our way back to paradise. If the story stopped there, the vineyard would simply remain a symbol of human tragedy. But God is not finished with the image of the vine. If humanity cannot cultivate a vineyard of righteousness, God decides He will do it Himself. He will become the master gardener. He will choose a specific plot of land, prepare the soil, and plant a new vine of His own making. And the next scene shows exactly how God begins this work. If humanity could not cultivate a lasting vineyard, God would have to do it Himself. And He does exactly that. But He does not start by looking for better soil. He looks for a people. To understand how God plants His own vineyard, you have to read the poetry of the Hebrew Bible. The book of Psalms gives us the clearest picture of what God was doing when He rescued Israel from slavery. In Psalm 80, verse 8, the writer looks back at the Exodus and says this to God: "You brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it." That is the biblical image of the Exodus. It was not just a political liberation. It was a divine transplanting. God reached into the brutal, oppressive empire of Pharaoh, carefully uprooted a group of broken slaves, and carried them across a barren wilderness to plant them in a new land. He became the vine dresser. He cleared the ground. He drove out the stones of the nations before them. He gave them deep roots so they would fill the land. But the prophet Isaiah takes the image even deeper, and he makes it much more intimate. In Isaiah chapter 5, the prophet stands up and sings a song. It is called the Song of the Vineyard. At first, it sounds like a simple agricultural poem, but it quickly reads like a tragic love story. Isaiah describes a master gardener who plants a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He digs it up, clears it of stones, and plants it with the choicest, most expensive vines. He builds a watchtower in the middle of it. He cuts out a winepress in the solid rock. He puts up a thick wall to protect it from wild animals. Isaiah makes it clear that the gardener is the Lord of armies, and the vineyard is the house of Israel. Notice the extreme level of care. This is not casual, distant farming. This is intense, covenant love. God gives Israel His law to act as a protective wall against the surrounding empires. He gives them prophets and priests to act as a watchtower. He gives them a temple to be the center of their national life. He surrounds them with every possible advantage. God does not ask the vine to do the heavy lifting. The vine dresser does all the difficult work. The vine dresser prepares the environment. All the vine has to do is stay rooted in the good soil, receive the rain, and bear the fruit it was designed to produce. And what was that fruit? God was not looking for religious ceremonies. He was not looking for a calendar full of festivals. He was looking for the fruit of a transformed society. He was waiting for a nation that would look like Him to the rest of the world. In the Hebrew text, the fruit God desires is described with two specific words: justice and righteousness. He wanted a society where the vulnerable were protected, where the poor were cared for, and where truth was upheld. Israel was meant to be the place where the world could come and taste the goodness of God. The national vineyard was supposed to be a living, breathing demonstration of God's character. The preparation was flawless. The master gardener had done everything right. The soil was perfect. The protection was absolute. But when the time came for the harvest, something went terribly wrong. The preparation was flawless. The master gardener had done everything right. The soil was perfect. The protection was absolute, and the chosen vine was planted. But the prophet Isaiah records the heartbreaking result. In chapter 5, verse 7, the Song of the Vineyard delivers its central devastating line. Isaiah says that God looked for justice, but saw bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but heard a cry of distress. In English, the tragedy is clear. But in the original Hebrew, the poetry contains a striking, tragic wordplay. God looked for justice. The Hebrew word is mishpat, but instead, he saw bloodshed. The Hebrew word is mispach. God looked for righteousness. The word is tzedakah, but he heard the desperate cry of the oppressed. The word is tzeakah. The words sound almost identical. The nation looked like the real thing on the outside. They had the temple. They had the sacrifices. They had the religious calendar. They had the right vocabulary. But the fruit was bitter. Instead of cultivating a society of radical mercy, they had become exactly like the surrounding empires. The vulnerable were crushed. The poor were ignored. The leaders were corrupt. They had produced wild grapes. The prophet Jeremiah picked up the exact same image. In Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 21, God asks the heartbreaking question, "I planted you as a choice vine, from the purest stock. How then did you turn degenerate and become a wild vine?" Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random set of details or disconnected garden stories. The vineyard is the story of God's covenant project with humanity. The word appeared first in one place, then moved into another, and now the same truth is becoming harder to miss. Humanity, even when given the perfect soil and the perfect law, cannot produce the fruit of righteousness on its own. The vine was fundamentally broken. And what happens to a broken vineyard? God tells Isaiah exactly what will happen. Because the vine refused to bear the fruit of justice, God would remove its protective hedge. He would break down the wall. He would let the vineyard be trampled. This was not an angry, impulsive destruction. It was a tragic unplanting. God allowed the surrounding empires to enter. The Babylonians swept through the land like wild animals. They broke down the walls of Jerusalem. They destroyed the great temple where the golden vine hung over the doors. They uprooted the people and carried them away into exile. The vineyard was left in ruins. For hundreds of years, the prophets promised that God would one day restore his planting. They promised that the master gardener would not abandon his project forever. They spoke of a future day when the mountains would drip with sweet wine and the ruined cities would be rebuilt. But generations passed. The people eventually returned to the land, but the true glory never fully returned. They were ruled by the Greeks and then violently occupied by the Romans. The nation was fractured, exhausted, and desperately waiting. The vineyard remained a shadow of what it was supposed to be. That is the history. That is the weight of the image. That is the story every Jewish person in the first century carried in their bones. For centuries, the vineyard lay broken and overgrown, until one night, in an upper room in Jerusalem, the image returned. The shadow of the Roman Empire hung heavily over Jerusalem. For centuries, the people had been waiting for God to restore his ruined vineyard. And then, on the night before his death, Jesus gathers his disciples in the upper room and speaks the words that bring the entire biblical pattern to its climax. "I am the true vine." Now, that single word "true" carries its full, tremendous weight. Jesus is not giving a casual gardening tip. He is making a sovereign, covenant declaration. When he calls himself the true vine, he is not saying the old vine was a mistake. The old covenant was not bad. It was incomplete. It was the shadow, and he is the substance. The ancient pattern was real, but the reality he brings is greater. Israel was planted to be the vine that brought God's justice and mercy to the surrounding nations, but the human heart proved too fractured to sustain it. So Jesus steps directly into the place of the nation. He takes the heavy identity of Israel upon his own shoulders. He is doing what humanity could not do. He is producing the perfect fruit of obedience, truth, and covenant love that the master gardener had been looking for since the floodwaters receded in Genesis. This is the great reversal of the story. Not replacement, but fulfillment. Not a discarded project, but the completion of an ancient promise. God did not throw away the vineyard. He entered it himself. Jesus is telling his closest friends that the life of God, the favor of God, and the fruitfulness of God are no longer found in a geographical piece of land. They are no longer tied to the massive golden vine hanging over the temple doors in Jerusalem. They are found exclusively in him. But Jesus does not stop with his own identity. He immediately expands the image to include the rest of the story. In John chapter 15, verse 1, he adds a crucial detail. He says, "And my Father is the vine dresser." This is a breathtaking moment of continuity. The master gardener from Isaiah chapter 5 has not abandoned his work. God has not walked away from the soil. He is still actively tending the vineyard. He is still deeply, fiercely invested in the final harvest. But this time, the planted vine will not yield the bitter, wild grapes of oppression. This time, the vine will not fail, because the vine is the Son of God. And then, Jesus introduces the final, most intimate element of the image. He looks at the disciples sitting around the table. These are ordinary, flawed men. They are about to scatter in fear. But he looks at them and says, "You are the branches." He is inviting them into a completely new way of being human. They do not have to clear the heavy stones. They do not have to build the watchtower. They do not have to plant their own perfect vineyard of righteousness from scratch. They simply have to attach themselves to the true vine, and his indestructible life will flow directly into them. It is a beautiful, profound picture of grace, provision, and absolute rest. The long wait is over. The true vine has finally taken root in the earth. But stepping into this new, living vine introduces a detail that has terrified readers for generations. Stepping into this new, living vine introduces a detail that has troubled readers for generations. In John chapter 15, verse 2, Jesus says that his Father is the vine dresser, and the vine dresser has a knife. Jesus tells his disciples, "Every branch in me that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit." For many people, this sounds terrifying. It sounds like a spiritual threat. We often read this verse through a lens of deep anxiety. It feels as if God is standing over us with a blade, waiting for us to fail. If we do not produce enough, he will cut us off and throw us away. And if we do manage to succeed, our only reward is to be cut anyway, pushed harder to produce even more. But we are reading this like modern factory workers, not like ancient farmers. We are imagining an assembly line, not a vineyard. To understand the vine dresser's knife, we have to look carefully at the language Jesus is using, and the way ancient vineyards were actually kept. Jesus says that every branch that does not bear fruit, the Father takes away. The Greek word translated as takes away is airo. While it can be used to mean remove, many scholars point out that its fundamental root, meaning, is to lift up. In the first century, if a branch was failing to bear fruit, it was usually because it had fallen into the dirt. It was covered in mud, shadowed from the sun, and vulnerable to disease. A master gardener did not immediately walk through the vineyard, violently hacking off struggling branches. He reached down into the mud. He lifted the branch up, he washed it, and he tied it back to the trellis so it could catch the wind and the light. The vine dresser does not abandon a struggling branch. He repositions it so it can live. But what about the branches that are already bearing fruit? Jesus says the Father prunes them. Here again, the language does something beautiful. The Greek word for prune is katheiro. It does mean to prune, but the literal translation is to cleanse. or to purify. In fact, in the very next breath, in verse 3, Jesus uses the exact same root word to comfort his disciples. He says, "Already you are clean because of the word I have spoken to you." The pruning is a cleansing. A vine is a sprawling, chaotic plant. Left to itself, it will put all of its energy into growing long, leafy shoots that look impressive but yield absolutely no fruit. The vine dresser cuts away the useless wood. He cuts away the wild growth that is draining the energy of the branch. He does this so that the rich, life-giving sap of the vine can flow directly into the grapes. The knife is not a weapon. It is a tool of careful, intentional formation. When God prunes, it is not a sign of his anger. It is a sign of his intense, personal attention. He is cutting away the distractions, the dead wood, and the false identities that keep us from bringing his life into the world. He is removing everything that is not the true vine. And once we realize the knife is not meant to destroy us, it changes how we hear the single most important command Jesus gives to the branches. Jesus has just told his disciples they are clean. The vine dresser's knife has done its work. And now, he gives them their primary instruction. In John chapter 15, verse 4, he says, "Abide in me, and I in you." It is the single most important command given to the branches. But for modern English readers, it is also one of the most easily misunderstood. When we hear the word abide, we often think of two things. We either think of passive waiting, like sitting quietly in a room, or we think of a heavy moral obligation, like abiding by the rules of a strict contract. We turn the command into a checklist of spiritual disciplines. We think abiding means reading more, praying harder, and trying our best not to fail. But the text is doing something deeper here. The word Jesus uses is the Greek word meno. It begins with the idea of remaining, staying, or enduring. In ordinary usage, it could describe a person taking up permanent residence in a house. They are not just visiting. They have moved in. The English translation is not wrong, but it is not quite large enough to carry the full weight of the original word. Jesus is not telling his disciples to follow a new set of rules. He is telling them to make their permanent home in his love. To see why that matters, look at how a physical vine actually works. A branch does not strain to produce a grape. It does not flex. It does not stress. It does not grit its teeth and try to manufacture a harvest through sheer willpower. The branch has exactly one job: attachment. If the branch simply refuses to disconnect from the central vine, the life of the vine will inevitably push its way through the wood and produce the fruit. The fruit is not the result of the branch's agonizing effort. It is the natural consequence of the branch's location. This is a profound reversal of how we normally think about human transformation. Jesus tells his disciples, "As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me." He follows it with a stark, quiet warning. "Apart from me, you can do nothing." Pause for a second and look at the movement. Jesus is looking back at the centuries of biblical history. The nation of Israel tried to produce the fruit of justice, righteousness, and peace on their own. They had the law, they had the temple, and they had the prophets, but human strength could not sustain it. They tried to manufacture the harvest, and it resulted in wild, bitter grapes. Jesus is telling his friends not to make the same mistake. The fruit of God's kingdom cannot be manufactured. You cannot tape fake fruit onto a disconnected branch and call it a vineyard. The work of the disciple is not performance, it is participation. Not striving, but abiding. Not building a vineyard from scratch, but resting in the true vine. When the disciples finally understood this, it shifted the entire burden of their coming mission. They were about to be sent out into a brutal, unforgiving empire. They were going to face prison, exile, and execution. If their job was to save the world in their own strength, they would have been crushed. But their job was simply to stay connected to the source of life and let the vine dresser worry about the yield. But this raises one final question. If the Father is the vine dresser and Jesus is the true vine, and we are the branches, what is all this fruit actually for? If the Father is the vine dresser, and Jesus is the true vine, and we are the branches, what is all this fruit actually for? It is a question we rarely ask. We are so heavily focused on our own personal spiritual growth that we forget how a physical vineyard actually functions. A vine does not consume its own grapes. A branch does not eat its own fruit. The harvest is never for the plant itself. The harvest is for the world. God did not plant the nation of Israel in the ancient Near East just to have a private, walled garden. He planted them so the surrounding empires could look at their society and taste His justice, His righteousness, and His mercy. And when Jesus becomes the true vine, His purpose is exactly the same. He is producing the life of God so that it can be poured out for a thirsty, exhausted world. To understand what this final harvest looks like, we have to listen to the prophets one last time. When the prophet Amos looked past the heartbreaking failure of the old vineyard, he saw a future day of complete restoration. In Amos chapter 9, verse 13, God makes a promise that defies natural agriculture. He says the days are coming when the one who plows will overtake the one who reaps, and the mountains will drip with sweet wine. It is an image of staggering, impossible abundance. It is the new Eden. It is the perfect, lasting rest that Noah was desperately trying to plant in Genesis, finally realized. Jesus knew exactly what He was doing when He stepped into this ancient imagery. It is no accident that His very first public miracle was turning water into an overwhelming abundance of the best wine at a wedding in Cana. He was quietly announcing that the days of Amos chapter 9 had finally arrived. The true vine was in the soil, and the final vintage was beginning to flow. And it is no accident that on the very night He gave the teaching of the vine, sitting in that upper room, He lifted a cup and called it the blood of the new covenant. He was offering the perfect, final harvest. But this time, the fruit of the vine was His own life, completely crushed and poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Pause and look at the entire journey. It began in the dirt of a newly washed world. A man tried to plant a vineyard of peace with his own hands, but he only found nakedness and shame. It moved into the land of promise. God planted a nation with perfect covenant care, but human rebellion turned the yield into wild, bitter grapes of oppression. Then, the pattern reached its climax in Jerusalem. A single man sat with his ordinary friends and took the entire weight of that ancient failure onto his own shoulders. Not a new rule, but a new life. Not a demand for better performance, but an invitation into absolute rest. He became the true vine, so that we would never have to strive to build our own righteousness again. He took the violent cut of the vine dresser's knife on the cross, being temporarily taken away, so that we could be permanently grafted in. And now, He offers us the single, quiet command to simply abide, to stay closely attached, to let His indestructible life become our life. If tracing this pattern has helped you see Scripture with fresh eyes, subscribe so you do not miss the next study. The image of the vine was never just a casual metaphor. It was the long, deliberate story of a God who refused to leave His world barren, choosing to plant His own life in the dark so the rest of us could finally taste the harvest.